For years, Resident Evil fans have been stuck in the same miserable loop. A new adaptation gets announced, hope rises for about 5 minutes, and then reality hits like a zombie through a boarded-up window. Either the story drifts so far away from the games that the name barely means anything anymore, or the movie borrows familiar names and places without understanding what actually makes Resident Evil feel like Resident Evil. That is why Zach Cregger's new movie has been such a strange case from the start. It immediately divided people. Some fans were frustrated that it would not simply hand them a straight Leon S. Kennedy adaptation or a clean retelling of the most beloved games. But now that Cregger has explained how he is approaching this film, I think something very important is becoming clear. This may not be the Resident Evil movie some fans expected, but it may finally be the one that understands the games. And honestly, that difference matters more than people think. Because the biggest mistake fans can make right now is looking at this movie only through the lens of plot fidelity. If all you care about is whether every timeline detail lines up perfectly with Resident Evil 2 or whether a certain iconic hero gets the spotlight, then you may miss what Cregger seems to be doing. He's not talking like a director who just recognizes the brand. He is talking like someone who understands the rhythm of playing Resident Evil, and that is a much bigger deal than it sounds. That rhythm is everything. Resident Evil is not just zombies, laboratories, or umbrella logos. It is anxiety. It is moving carefully through hostile space while managing limited resources. It is the fear of opening a door when you are not sure you have enough ammo for what might be behind it. It is scavenging for herbs, keys, bullets, and puzzle pieces while the world around you gets worse. It is the pressure of deciding whether to fight, flee, or risk wasting supplies you may desperately need later. That feeling is the heart of the games, and for the first time in a long time, a filmmaker attached to Resident Evil is describing the adaptation in those exact terms. Cregger reportedly pointed to little details in the trailer and spoke very directly about wanting the film to move the way a Resident Evil game moves. That alone is huge. He is emphasizing resource management, item hunting, environmental puzzles, weapon upgrades, and a protagonist who feels closer in spirit to Ethan Winters than to a polished action icon like Chris Redfield. That is a fascinating choice, and honestly, it may be the smartest one he could have made. A Resident Evil movie should not feel like a superhero assignment with monsters in the background. It should feel like an ordinary person being dragged through a nightmare that keeps escalating faster than they can control it. That is why the idea of following a more random survivor in Raccoon City actually excites me. On paper, I completely understand why that upsets some fans. People have spent years wanting a truly faithful big-screen Leon, Claire, Jill, or Chris, but the second you step back and think about the larger experience of Resident Evil, the choice starts to make sense. The games work because the world feels larger than any one character. Raccoon City is terrifying not just because famous heroes are inside it, but because anyone trapped there is basically one bad hallway away from death. Putting the audience in the shoes of someone more vulnerable, less iconic, and less protected by franchise expectations could actually bring the series closer to its roots. In that sense, this movie sounds weirdly close to Resident Evil Outbreak in spirit. Outbreak was built around the idea that horror in Raccoon City was bigger than the usual protagonists. It widened the nightmare and let the city itself become the main character. That seems to be part of what Cregger is chasing. He has apparently imagined the story unfolding during the same broader catastrophe as Resident Evil 2, only somewhere else in the city. That is a very clever angle. It preserves the myth of the famous game events while carving out room for a new survival story. Now, does that mean everything lines up perfectly with the games? No, and that is where things get messy, because even if Cregger's understanding of the gameplay experience sounds incredibly promising, some of the world-building choices still look strange. The snowy setting is a huge one. Raccoon City, as fans know it during the Outbreak timeline, does not exactly match a winter horror movie. The same goes for the faster zombies hinted at in footage. Traditional Raccoon City zombies in the early games are terrifying partly because of the way they advance with stubborn, ugly inevitability. They do not need to sprint to be dangerous. Making them faster risks shifting the tone away from dread and toward a more generic infection thriller. So yes, those concerns are real, and fans are right to point them out. If the goal were strict lore fidelity, those details would be hard to ignore. But here is where I think the conversation gets more interesting. What if exact continuity is not the main standard this film should be judged by? What if the more important question is whether the movie can capture the sensation of playing Resident Evil better than any of the previous adaptations did? Because if it does that, it may achieve something the franchise has failed to pull off for decades. That is why I keep coming back to Cregger's own background as a fan. You can usually tell when a director is speaking in borrowed language, repeating terms he knows the audience wants to hear. This does not sound like that. It sounds like someone who genuinely understands why people love these games beyond surface iconography. He is not just talking about monsters and Easter eggs. He is talking about progression, pressure, discovery, and escalation. The actual interactive grammar of Resident Evil and turning that into film language is exactly the challenge every previous adaptation either ignored or misunderstood. It also helps that Cregger is not exactly coming into this empty-handed. Barbarian proved he knows how to weaponize space, uncertainty, and audience expectation. Weapons already has people paying closer attention to what he might do next. So even though his Resident Evil approach initially sounded risky, it now sounds risky in the right way. Not reckless, not clueless. Risky like someone trying to adapt the experience instead of the wiki page. And that might be the point where the series finally breaks its curse. Resident Evil adaptations have spent years either betraying the games in loud ways or worshipping scattered details without understanding the machine underneath. This new movie may still take liberties. It may still frustrate fans who want a cleaner canon translation. But if it can make me feel like I am trapped in a Resident Evil scenario instead of just watching people run through a generic zombie movie with familiar names, that is already a massive upgrade. Honestly, that is the standard I would use. Not whether every date matches. Not whether the snow should be there. Not whether Leon is standing exactly where fans want him. I want to know whether the movie understands fear as a system. Whether it understands that Resident Evil is built on tension, scarcity, navigation, and the awful little decisions that make survival feel earned. If it understands that, then it understands more than most of the franchise's live-action history ever did. So no, Zach Cregger's Resident Evil may not be the exact adaptation many fans spent years imagining.